Lonely rancher took in 16-year-old girl who was left tied to a fence, the best Wild West stories. The wind rolled across the empty plains like a whisper from heaven, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and dust. Samuel Dier, a rancher who had lived more years alone than with company, pulled his worn head lower against the glaring sun as he checked his cattle spread across the valley. His ranch stretched wide, miles of emptiness broken only by barbed wire and the lowing of cows. Folks in town called him the lonely rancher, not out of cruelty but plain truth. His wife had died young, his children had never come, and his life was measured in seasons, not in laughter. Yet beneath the weathered face and calloused hands, Samuel carried a heart that had never quite lost its softness. He would mend a neighbor's fence before his own, leave feed for a starving horse, and bow his head every evening by the fire, though he no longer asked God for much. That morning, as he rode along the far fence line, Samuel spotted something unusual. At first it looked like a torn blanket flapping against the posts, but as he drew nearer, the shape grew clearer, too small to be a grown man, too still to be a wild animal. His horse shied, sensing something wrong, and Samuel's chest tightened with dread. He dismounted, boots crunching against the brittle ground, and then his breath caught in his throat. Tied to the fence with a frayed rope was a girl, barely more than a child, 16 at most, her wrists red and raw where she had struggled against her bonds. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, lips cracked from thirst. Samuel's hands trembled as he cut her loose. "Easy, now," he murmured, the same tone he used with frightened calves. The girl collapsed into his arms, so light he could have sworn the wind itself carried more weight. "You're safe," he whispered, though he wasn't sure it was true. He laid her across his horse and rode back to the ranch with urgency, every mile echoing with questions. Who would do such a thing? Why here, in the middle of nowhere? And most of all, what would he do with her once she was safe? Samuel had spent so long living with silence, he wasn't sure he knew how to live with another human soul, especially one so wounded. At the ranch house, Samuel set her gently on the bed that had long been empty. He fetched water, bread, and a blanket, watching as she sipped like a sparrow too weak to swallow. When at last her eyes fluttered open, they revealed a startling mixture of fear and defiance, as though she had learned already that life was not to be trusted. "What's your name, child?" Samuel asked softly. "Clara," she whispered, her voice thin as thread. "Clara," Samuel repeated, letting the name settle on his tongue like a prayer. "You're safe here. Nobody's gonna hurt you under this roof." For days, Clara barely spoke. She ate little, slept long, and woke crying out from nightmares that Samuel pretended not to hear through the thin walls. Yet he was there each morning with a plate of eggs, each evening with a lamp left burning so she wouldn't wake in darkness. He didn't press her for answers, though the questions burned in his chest. He only gave her space, because kindness, he knew, could not be forced, it had to be offered like water, and accepted when thirst became too great. Little by little, Clara's silence cracked. She told Samuel she had no parents left, her father had died in a mining accident, her mother from fever the year after. She had been taken in by distant relatives who treated her less like kin and more like burden. When food ran low, she became the one thing they thought expendable. Samuel didn't ask for details of how she ended up tied to a fence on the lonely plains, some truths were too cruel to drag back into daylight. All he said was, well, they were wrong. Nobody's expendable, Clara. Least of all you. The ranch began to change with her presence. Where once silence had stretched between walls, now there were soft footsteps, the sound of dishes washed by smaller hands, the rare but precious lilt of a young girl humming to herself. Samuel found himself rising earlier, not just to feed cattle but to make sure Clara had fresh biscuits. It taught her to ride, to rope, to mend a fence. She was quick to learn, quicker to laugh than he had dared hope. And though Samuel told himself he was simply keeping her safe until she was strong enough to choose her own path, a quiet truth grew in his heart, she had already become family, the daughter he had never been given. But the world, especially the West, was not kind for long. One evening as the sun bled into the horizon, riders came down the trail. 3 men, hard-eyed and hungry, the kind who took what they wanted and left ruin behind. Samuel stepped onto the porch, rifle across his arm. "Evening, he said calmly, though his heart thudded. The leader, a broad man with a scar down his cheek, is native. We're looking for a girl. 16. Is crowny ting. Folks say a rancher's got her hid away. Clara froze inside the doorway, her breath sharp as glass. Samuel shifted his stance, the barrel of the rifle gleaming. "Ain't no girl here but my daughter," he said evenly, the word daughter ringing out with surprising strength. "And she's got no business with the likes of you." The men muttered, weighing threat against caution. They had expected weakness, not defiance. Finally, the scarred men spat in the dust. "Keep your brat, old man. She ain't worth the trouble." They rode off, the echo of hooves fading into night. Samuel stood motionless until they were gone, then lowered the rifle with trembling hands. "Inside," Clara clung to him, silent tears soaking his shirt. For the first time in years, Samuel prayed out loud, thanking God not for survival, but for the chance to protect someone who mattered. From that night forward, Clara called him Pa. At first it was shy, almost accidental, but Samuel's eyes stung each time he heard it. The loneliness that had once been his only companion began to dissolve, replaced by purpose. It was no longer just a rancher keeping cattle alive, he was a father keeping a soul alive. Saison's turn. Clara grew stronger, her cheeks filling with color, her laughter carrying across the valley like music. She stitched curtains for the windows, planted flowers along the porch, and even convinced Samuel to join her at the town fair, where folks marveled at how the lonely rancher seemed somehow less alone. When a neighbor joked that Samuel had finally found his reason to smile, Samuel only tipped his head and said, "Reckon I didn't find her. Reckon she found me." Years later, when Clara was grown, she would tell others of the day Samuel cut her loose from that fence. She spoke not of her suffering but of his kindness, the man who gave her not just food and shelter but dignity, love, and a family where none had existed. And Samuel, who had once expected to die alone on the prairie, found himself surrounded not by silence but by the laugh of a daughter who refused to let his heart stay empty. The lonely rancher was lonely no more. And though the West remained wild, though hardship never truly ended, there was a home on one quiet stretch of prairie where hope had taken root. It stood as proof that compassion is stronger than cruelty, that love can grow even in barren soil, and that sometimes the greatest stories are not of battles won or fortunes made, but of a simple act of kindness that changes two lives forever.